A painful encounter. Elijah Thompson, a curious and cheerful 9-year-old, had always found joy in the little things. His mornings were often filled with the scent of his mother's lavender lotion as she combed through his tightly coiled hair and the sound of her humming gospel tunes that filled their modest apartment. That morning was no different, except for the dull ache that had started to creep into his stomach just before breakfast. As he walked the halls of St. Thomas Elementary School, clutching his stomach, the buzz of other students seemed to fade into the background. Elijah didn't like to miss class. He loved his teacher, Mr. Harris, and his friends often turned to him for help with their math problems. But today, the ache was unbearable. Summoning courage, Elijah made his way to the nurse's office, a small room tucked away at the end of the main hallway. He hesitated outside the door for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The office smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a mix that would have been comforting if not for the cold glare of Mrs. Blackwell, the school nurse. She was seated at her desk, her back to him, typing something on her computer. Her steel-gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and the sharp lines of her face seemed etched in permanent displeasure. "Excuse me, Mrs. Blackwell," Elijah began, his voice timid and shaky. "I don't feel so good." Mrs. Blackwell turned slowly in her chair, her eyes meeting his with a piercing gaze that made Elijah feel small. Her expression was not one of concern, but rather one of irritation. She took him in with a quick sweep of her eyes, her lips tightening into a thin line. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, her voice clipped. "My stomach hurts," Elijah mumbled, shifting uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Mrs. Blackwell's eyes narrowed further as she leaned back in her chair. "When was the last time you took a shower, young man?" Elijah blinked, confused. He had expected questions about his symptoms, or maybe even a thermometer pressed to his forehead, but not this. I took one this morning, ma'am," he replied softly, his heart pounding. Mrs. Blackwell let out a scoff that echoed in the small room. "I find that hard to believe. Look at the state of you." Elijah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He glanced down at his outfit, a neatly ironed polo shirt and jeans his mother had laid out for him, paired with his favorite sneakers. There was nothing wrong with his clothes. Mrs. Blackwell stood and began circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. Her sharp gaze lingered on his hair, neatly braided into cornrows, and then on his hands, which were clean save for the faint remnants of graphite from his morning art class. "Your hair is a mess," she said, wrinkling her nose. "And what's that smell? It's like you've been rolling in dirt." Tears pricked the corners of Elijah's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had no idea what she was talking about. His mother always made sure he looked presentable before school, even if it meant waking up an hour earlier to iron his clothes or rebraid his hair. "I don't smell, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't argue with me." Mrs. Blackwell snapped, her voice sharp enough to make him flinch. "You need to learn some basic hygiene, young man. Go to the sink and wash your hands properly. Maybe then you'll feel better." Elijah's stomach churned, not from illness, but from the sting of her words. He walked over to the sink in the corner of the room, his steps heavy. As he washed his hands, scrubbing until his skin turned red, he fought back the sob building in his chest. Mrs. Blackwell didn't bother to examine him or ask further questions about his stomachache. Instead, she returned to her desk, muttering something under her breath about dirty children and bad parenting. When Elijah finished, he dried his hands on a paper towel and turned to face her. "May I go back to class now?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Blackwell waved him off with a dismissive hand. "Go on, then, and tell your parents to teach you some proper hygiene." Elijah walked out of the office with his head down, the door closing behind him with a soft click. His stomachache had not subsided, but now it was accompanied by a deep sense of shame that he couldn't shake. By lunchtime, word had spread among his classmates. Someone had overheard Mrs. Blackwell's loud remarks and told others, and soon the whispers followed him wherever he went. "Did you hear? The nurse said Elijah smells. Maybe that's why he sits at the back of the class." "Yeah, and have you seen his shoes? That he doesn't even have new ones." Elijah's best friend, Marcus, tried to cheer him up. "Don't listen to them, man. They're just being dumb," he said, offering Elijah half of his sandwich. But Elijah barely touched his lunch, his appetite replaced by a lump in his throat. When the final bell rang, Elijah trudged home, dreading the moment he'd have to tell his father what had happened. His dad, Mr. Thompson, was a proud man who worked long hours at a local factory to provide for Elijah and his two younger sisters. He always told Elijah to hold his head high no matter what. But today, Elijah felt like he couldn't. When he walked through the front door, his father was sitting at the kitchen table, helping his youngest daughter with her homework. He looked up and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Elijah," he said, his deep voice full of concern, "what happened at school today?" And just like that, the tears Elijah had been holding back all day came pouring out. He told his father everything: the stomachache, Mrs. Blackwell's remarks, and the whispers from his classmates. Mr. Thompson listened quietly, his jaw tightening with every word. When Elijah finished, his father stood, his face a mix of anger and determination. "This isn't right," he said firmly. "Nobody has the right to treat you like that, Elijah. We're going to get to the bottom of this." And with that, Mr. Thompson grabbed his coat, ready to confront the school nurse who had not only insulted his son, but also ignited a fire he wouldn't let burn out. This was just the beginning. Little did Elijah know, the events that followed would not only expose a shocking secret, but also teach him and his family the true meaning of resilience and dignity. The confrontation. Mr. Thompson was a man of quiet strength. He wasn't one to raise his voice unless absolutely necessary, and he approached every situation with a calm but resolute demeanor. But as he walked into St. Thomas Elementary School that afternoon, his jaw was set, his fists clenched at his sides. No child, especially not his son, deserved to be humiliated in such a way. Elijah trailed behind him, his small frame dwarfed by his father's sturdy build. His heart pounded in his chest as they walked past the colorful bulletin boards and empty classrooms. School was over for the day, and the hallways were quiet, save for the occasional murmur of teachers wrapping up their day. When they reached the nurse's office, Mr. Thompson knocked sharply on the door, his deep voice cutting through the stillness. "Mrs. Blackwell." "Come in," came the curt reply. Mr. Thompson pushed the door open and stepped inside, his tall frame nearly filling the small room. Mrs. Blackwell looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from annoyance to a guarded curiosity as she took in the imposing figure before her. Elijah hovered in the doorway, his stomach churning with unease. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Blackwell began, her tone brisk. "What can I do for you?" "You can start," Mr. Thompson said evenly, though his voice carried an edge, "by explaining why my son came home today feeling ashamed and humiliated after visiting your office." Mrs. Blackwell stiffened, her eyes flicking toward Elijah, who stood silently beside his father. "I simply pointed out a few areas where he could improve his hygiene," she said, her tone defensive. "It's my duty to ensure the students here are healthy and well-kept." "Hygiene," Mr. Thompson repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Elijah takes a shower every morning. He wears clean clothes to school, and his mother and I make sure he's well cared for. What exactly gave you the impression that my son needed a lesson in hygiene?" Mrs. Blackwell folded her arms across her chest, her gaze hardening. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, your son came in here looking disheveled and smelling of, well, let's just say it wasn't pleasant. I merely addressed what I observed." Elijah felt his cheeks burn with humiliation all over again. He wanted to shrink into himself, to disappear from the room entirely. But his father's presence gave him a small sense of security, even as Mrs. Blackwell's words stung like a slap. Mr. Thompson stepped closer to her desk, his voice firm. You observed wrong. Elijah is a bright, clean, and respectful child. What you did wasn't helping him. It was tearing him down. A nurse's job is to care for the students, not to humiliate them." Mrs. Blackwell's nostrils flared, but before she could respond, Mr. Thompson continued, "Let me ask you something. Did you even bother to ask Elijah about his symptoms, or were you too busy judging him based on some false assumption?" For a moment, Mrs. Blackwell said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Mr. Thompson's voice softened, but it carried a weight that filled the room. "You looked at my son and saw what you wanted to see, not the truth, and because of that, he spent the rest of his day feeling less than. You owe him an apology." Mrs. Blackwell's face flushed a deep red, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. "Mr. Thompson," she said stiffly, "I believe I acted within the scope of my responsibilities. If you have a complaint, you're welcome to take it up with the school administration." "I intend to," Mr. Thompson said, his tone unwavering. He turned to Elijah and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go, son." As they left the office, Elijah felt a strange mix of emotions. He was grateful for his father's defense, but the encounter had left him drained. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he trusted his father to stand by him. That evening, Mr. Thompson sat at the kitchen table with his wife, Lisa, going over the events of the day. Lisa was livid when she heard what had happened. She paced the small kitchen, her hands on her hips, shaking her head in disbelief. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice tight with anger. How dare she talk to Elijah like that? And in a school, no less. This is where he's supposed to feel safe. "I know," Mr. Thompson said, his voice calm but firm. "That's why we're going to address this head-on. I'm meeting with the principal tomorrow." Lisa nodded, her expression softening as she looked at Elijah, who was sitting quietly at the table, picking at the food on his plate. "Elijah, honey, you know none of this is your fault, right?" Elijah nodded slowly, but the shame lingered in his eyes. "Why did she say those things, Mom?" he asked softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Lisa knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers. "Sometimes people say hurtful things because of their own ignorance or prejudice. It's not about you, sweetheart. It's about them. You are smart, kind, and loved, and no one can take that away from you." Elijah nodded again, this time with a little more conviction. His parents' unwavering support gave him a glimmer of hope, even as the weight of the day still pressed on him. The next morning, Mr. Thompson arrived at the school bright and early for his meeting with Principal Edwards, a middle-aged woman known for her no-nonsense approach. She listened intently as Mr. Thompson recounted the events in the nurse's office, her brow furrowing deeper with every detail. "Mr. Thompson," she said when he finished, "I want to assure you that this matter will be addressed. Our staff is expected to treat every student with respect and compassion, and Mrs. Blackwell's behavior falls far short of that standard." "I appreciate that," Mr. Thompson said, "but this isn't just about an apology. It's about ensuring that no other child has to go through what Elijah went through. I'm holding you accountable for making sure that happens." Principal Edwards nodded, her expression serious. "You have my word, Mr. Thompson. I'll be speaking with Mrs. Blackwell immediately, and we'll be reviewing her conduct thoroughly. In the meantime, I'd like to arrange a meeting with you, your wife, and Elijah to ensure we're doing everything we can to support him moving forward." Mr. Thompson agreed, feeling a small sense of relief. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was a step in the right direction. As he left the principal's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mrs. Blackwell's behavior than simple ignorance. Her hostility had felt personal, almost as if it stemmed from something deeper. Little did he know, the truth behind Mrs. Blackwell's actions would soon come to light, revealing a shocking secret that would change everything. Unveiling the past. The days that followed the confrontation were tense for the Thompson family. Elijah returned to school, but the whispers and sideways glances from his classmates persisted. Even Marcus, his best friend, struggled to know how to help. Meanwhile, at home, Mr. Thompson prepared for the upcoming meeting with Principal Edwards and Mrs. Blackwell. His gut told him this was more than a misunderstanding, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. One evening, as Mr. Thompson sat at the kitchen table reviewing his notes, Lisa walked in carrying a stack of old photo albums. "What's that?" he asked, setting his pen down. "I've been thinking about this situation," Lisa said, placing the albums on the table. "You said Mrs. Blackwell seemed different, almost personal in the way she treated Elijah." "Yeah," Mr. Thompson replied, his brow furrowing. "It wasn't just about hygiene." She looked at him like. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Like she had some kind of grudge. Lisa finished. "Exactly," he said, nodding. Lisa flipped open one of the albums, revealing faded photographs from years ago. "I don't know if it's connected, but Mrs. Blackwell's name sounded familiar to me. I think she might have known my family back when we were kids. My mom used to mention a Miss Blackwell, though she wasn't married back then. She had a reputation for being, let's just say, not very kind." "Not very kind," Mr. Thompson repeated, his curiosity piqued. Lisa hesitated before answering. She was known for having a chip on her shoulder, especially toward black families in the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "If that's true, it could explain a lot. But we need more than just family gossip if we're going to address this." Lisa nodded, flipping through the pages of the album until she found what she was looking for, a grainy photo of a group of women standing in front of a church. "That's her," she said, pointing to a younger version of Mrs. Blackwell in the photo. "Where was this taken?" Mr. Thompson asked, leaning in to examine the photo more closely. "At Mount Zion Baptist Church, back in the late 80s, Lisa said. "My mom was part of the community outreach team there, and Miss Blackwell, well, Mrs. Blackwell now, worked at the local clinic. They didn't get along, to put it mildly. My mom always said Miss Blackwell had a way of looking down on families like ours." Mr. Thompson stared at the photo, a sense of unease settling over him. "This isn't just about Elijah then. It's about something deeper, something she's been holding on to for years." Lisa nodded, her expression grim. "If that's the case, we need to bring this up at the meeting. It's not just about her treatment of Elijah. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The day of the meeting arrived, and the Thompson family walked into the school's administrative building with a mix of determination and apprehension. Principal Edwards greeted them warmly, offering a firm handshake to both Mr. and Mrs. Thompson before turning her attention to Elijah. "Elijah, how are you doing?" she asked gently. "I'm okay," Elijah replied, though his voice was hesitant. "Good," the principal said with a reassuring smile. "We're here to make sure you feel safe and respected at school. Let's get started." They were led into a small conference room where Mrs. Blackwell was already seated. She looked uncomfortable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you all for coming," Principal Edwards began, taking a seat at the head of the table. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I want to start by reiterating that we take this matter very seriously. Mrs. Blackwell has been a valued member of our staff for many years, but her behavior in this instance was unacceptable." Mrs. Blackwell's lips thinned, but she said nothing. "Mrs. Blackwell," Mr. Thompson said, breaking the silence, "I'd like to ask you a question. Do you remember a woman named Sarah Johnson?" At the mention of the name, Mrs. Blackwell's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly masked her reaction. "I don't see how that's relevant," she said stiffly. "I think it's very relevant," Mr. Thompson continued. "Sarah Johnson was my wife's mother. She worked with you at the community clinic years ago." Mrs. Blackwell's face flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "She always spoke about how you treated families like ours," Lisa added, her voice steady but firm. "You looked at us like we were less than, like we didn't belong." Principal Edwards looked from the Thompsons to Mrs. Blackwell, her expression one of growing concern. "Mrs. Blackwell, is this true?" I don't see what this has to do with anything," Mrs. Blackwell said, her voice defensive. "It has everything to do with it," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "You didn't just judge Elijah for no reason. You looked at him and saw his skin color, his background, and whatever biases you've been holding onto for decades. That's not just unprofessional, it's harmful." Mrs. Blackwell was silent for a long moment, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the accusations was finally settling on her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "That's not enough," Lisa said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't just get to say sorry and move on. You need to confront whatever it is inside you that made you treat Elijah the way you did. Until you do that, you shouldn't be working with children." Principal Edwards nodded. "Mrs. Blackwell, I believe it's clear that this situation requires more than an apology. We will be conducting a thorough review of your conduct, both past and present. In the meantime, you will be placed on administrative leave." Mrs. Blackwell opened her mouth as if to protest, but the principal's stern expression silenced her. As the meeting concluded, the Thompsons left the school feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had taken a stand, but they knew the fight wasn't over. That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. His father had told him that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. For the first time in days, Elijah felt a sense of peace. Little did the Thompsons know, the events they had set into motion would ripple far beyond their family, sparking a much-needed conversation about prejudice, accountability, and the power of resilience. The ripple effect. The weeks following the meeting were anything but quiet. News of Mrs. Blackwell's behavior had spread through the school community like wildfire. Parents whispered in the pickup line, teachers exchanged concerned glances in the lounge, and the students, always attuned to the undercurrents of adult tension, could sense that something significant was unfolding. For the Thompsons, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy, though the experience lingered in their minds. Elijah's days became a mix of cautious optimism and lingering unease. Some classmates rallied to his side, while others avoided him altogether, as though proximity to the incident might bring them unwanted attention. At home, Elijah's parents kept a watchful eye on him. Though his spark was slowly returning, there were still moments when he seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts. One evening, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table working on his homework, Lisa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly. "How's school been this week?" "It's okay," Elijah replied, shrugging. "Some kids are nice, but some still look at me funny, like they're waiting for me to mess up or something." Lisa's heart ached at his words, but she forced a smile. "You just keep being you, Elijah. Those who really matter will see the amazing person you are." Elijah nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. Meanwhile, at the school, Principal Edwards began an in-depth review of Mrs. Blackwell's tenure. She combed through records, interviewed staff members, and even reached out to former students. What she discovered was both troubling and eye-opening. Subtle patterns of bias had threaded through Mrs. Blackwell's interactions for years. Some students reported feeling uncomfortable around her, but had never spoken up, assuming they were overreacting or that no one would believe them. Others described instances where Mrs. Blackwell had made dismissive or condescending comments, always just subtle enough to avoid formal complaints. As these accounts came to light, Principal Edwards realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Mrs. Blackwell's actions had been quietly harming students for years, and Elijah's case had finally brought the issue to the forefront. At the same time, Lisa and Mr. Thompson found themselves unexpectedly drawn into a larger conversation within their community. A group of parents, inspired by the Thompsons' courage, began organizing meetings to discuss equity and inclusion in the school system. The first meeting was held in the Thompson family's living room. A dozen parents crowded into the small space, some sitting on the couch, others perched on folding chairs or standing against the walls. "We've all seen it," said Rachel Martinez, a mother of two. "Subtle comments, little actions that make our kids feel like they don't belong. It's not just Mrs. Blackwell. It's a systemic problem." Heads nodded in agreement, and the room buzzed with quiet murmurs of assent. "We need to hold the school accountable," Rachel continued. "But we also need to support our kids and teach them to stand up for themselves. What Elijah went through shouldn't happen to anyone else." Lisa glanced at Elijah, who was sitting on the floor with some of the other children, coloring quietly. She felt a surge of pride and resolve. "We're with you," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we're ready to help." The parents began brainstorming ideas, workshops for teachers, diversity training, and initiatives to create a more inclusive school environment. They agreed to present their proposals to the school board, determined to turn their frustration into action. As the community rallied, Mrs. Blackwell's administrative leave stretched on. She remained largely out of sight, but whispers about her past began to surface. Lisa's instincts had been right. Mrs. Blackwell had long carried the weight of prejudice. One afternoon, Principal Edwards sat in her office, staring at a file in front of her. It contained a transcript of an interview with a retired teacher who had worked alongside Mrs. Blackwell decades earlier. "She always kept her distance," the teacher had said. "Never outright cruel, but there was a coldness about her. I think she struggled with her own insecurities and projected them onto others. But that doesn't excuse what she's done." Principal Edwards sighed, leaning back in her chair. She knew the decision she had to make, but it wouldn't be easy. A few days later, the school board convened a special meeting to address the situation. The Thompsons, along with other parents and community members, packed the small auditorium. Principal Edwards stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "We've conducted a thorough investigation into Mrs. Blackwell's conduct, and it's clear that her actions have had a negative impact on our students. Effective immediately, Mrs. Blackwell's employment with St. Thomas Elementary School is terminated." A ripple of murmurs swept through the audience. Some expressed relief, while others seemed conflicted. "But this is just the beginning," Principal Edwards continued. "We recognize that this incident has highlighted deeper issues within our school community. We are committed to making meaningful changes, starting with mandatory training for all staff on equity and inclusion. We will also be working with parents and students to ensure every child feels safe and valued at St. Thomas." Applause erupted, and the Thompsons exchanged relieved glances. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step forward. As the meeting concluded, Elijah approached the podium with his parents. He stood nervously in front of the crowd, clutching a piece of paper in his hands. "I wrote something," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Lisa knelt beside him, whispering encouragement. "Go ahead, sweetheart. You've got this." Elijah took a deep breath and began to read. "My name is Elijah Thompson. I'm 9 years old, and I love drawing, reading, and playing soccer. A few weeks ago, something happened that made me feel really bad about myself. But my parents taught me that I'm not what other people say I am. I'm proud of who I am, and I want everyone to feel that way too. So I hope we can all work together to make our school a place where everyone feels like they belong." The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Elijah looked up, his face glowing with pride. As the Thompsons left the meeting that evening, Elijah felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he truly believed that things could change, not just for him, but for everyone. Little did he know, his courage had sparked a movement that would ripple far beyond the walls of his school. A movement begins. The night of the school board meeting marked a turning point, not just for Elijah and his family, but for the entire community. The story of what had happened to Elijah and the actions taken to address it spread beyond St. Thomas Elementary. Parents from neighboring schools began reaching out to Lisa and Mr. Thompson, eager to learn how they could bring similar changes to their own children's schools. At first, the Thompsons felt overwhelmed by the attention. They had only wanted to protect Elijah and ensure that what he endured wouldn't happen again. But as more and more people reached out, it became clear that this was bigger than just one family or one school. One Saturday morning, Lisa and Mr. Thompson sat at the kitchen table with stacks of papers, emails printed out, and handwritten notes from parents across the district. Elijah sat nearby, drawing in his sketchpad, but occasionally glancing over, curious about the growing stack of papers. "This is a lot," Mr. Thompson said, rubbing his temples. "I had no idea so many people were dealing with similar issues." Lisa nodded, her gaze distant as she processed the scope of it. "We started something, Marcus. We can't just walk away from it now." "What are you thinking?" he asked, sensing the determination in her tone. "I'm thinking we need to organize," she replied. "Create something that can bring people together, not just to complain, but to create real solutions. Workshops, resources, support groups, something tangible." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Like a coalition or a task force." "Exactly," Lisa said, her excitement building. "Something parents, teachers, and even students can join. We can call it the Belonging Project." Elijah looked up from his drawing. "Belonging?" he asked. Lisa smiled at him. "Yes, sweetie, because everyone deserves to feel like they belong, no matter who they are or where they come from." Elijah nodded, then turned back to his drawing with a thoughtful expression. The following week, Lisa and Mr. Thompson held the first official meeting of the Belonging Project in the community center. They had expected maybe 20 people to show up, but by the time the meeting started, over 50 parents, teachers, and community leaders had packed into the room. Lisa stood at the front, a mix of nerves and determination coursing through her. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady despite the crowd. "When my son, Elijah, came home upset after being mistreated by someone who should have been looking out for him, I knew we had to take a stand. But as we started speaking out, we realized this isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about creating a culture where every child feels valued and respected." The room erupted in applause, and Lisa felt a surge of energy. "We're here tonight to talk about what we can do together," she continued. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better." Over the next 2 hours, the group discussed ideas, shared stories, and began to outline a plan of action. They agreed to start with a series of community events, including parent workshops, teacher training sessions, and student-led initiatives to promote kindness and inclusion. One of the most powerful moments came when Elijah stood up to speak. "I used to feel scared about going to school," he said, his small voice carrying across the room. "But now, I feel brave because I know my family and all of you are helping to make things better. I think kids like me just need to hear that they're not alone." Tears glistened in the eyes of many parents as they listened to Elijah's words. As the Belonging Project gained momentum, it began to attract attention from local media. A reporter from the city newspaper reached out to Lisa, asking to do a feature story on the initiative. At first, Lisa hesitated. She didn't want the spotlight on her family to overshadow the broader message of the project. But after discussing it with Mr. Thompson and Elijah, she agreed. The article, titled "A Family's Fight for Inclusion Sparks a Community Movement," painted a powerful picture of resilience and hope. It highlighted Elijah's courage, the Thompsons' determination, and the growing network of parents and educators working together to create change. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in to support the project, and people from other districts reached out, asking how they could replicate the model in their own communities. Meanwhile, at Street Thomas Elementary, the changes were already beginning to take shape. Under Principal Edwards' leadership, the school implemented new policies aimed at fostering inclusivity. Every staff member attended mandatory equity training, and the school created a diversity and inclusion committee that included parents, teachers, and even students. Elijah became a symbol of resilience for his classmates. Inspired by his bravery, other students began speaking up about their own experiences with bias or exclusion. The school even started a peer mentoring program, pairing older students with younger ones to create a stronger sense of community. One day, Elijah came home with a big grin on his face. "Guess what, Mom? Guess what, Dad?" he said, practically bouncing with excitement. "What's up, buddy?" Mr. Thompson asked, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. "They're letting me design the new mural for the school," Elijah exclaimed. "It's going to be all about belonging and kindness." Lisa and Mr. Thompson exchanged proud smiles. "That's amazing, Elijah," Lisa said, pulling him into a hug. "You're making the difference." As the Belonging Project continued to grow, Lisa and Mr. Thompson found themselves busier than ever. But no matter how hectic things became, they always made time for Elijah. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Elijah looked up from his sketchpad and said, "I'm glad we didn't just ignore what happened." Lisa wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "Me too, sweetheart. Sometimes, the hardest things we go through can lead to the most important changes." "And you know what?" Elijah said, his eyes bright with determination. "When I grow up, I'm going to keep helping people feel like they belong." In that moment, Lisa and Mr. Thompson knew that their family's journey was far from over. But they also knew they were building something lasting, something that would continue to grow and inspire others for years to come. The ripple effect had become a wave, and there was no stopping it now. A legacy of belonging. Months turned into a year, and the Belonging Project blossomed into something far greater than the Thompsons had ever imagined. What began as a response to a single act of prejudice had evolved into a community-wide movement. Across the district, schools were adopting the principles of inclusion, parents were engaging in honest conversations, and students were leading initiatives to foster kindness and understanding. For Elijah, life at St. Thomas Elementary was markedly different. The mural he had designed now adorned one of the main hallways, a vibrant explosion of colors featuring students of all races, abilities, and backgrounds standing together under the words, "We all belong." Every time he walked past it, he felt a surge of pride. But Elijah's impact wasn't limited to the mural. His story had inspired his classmates to take action in their own ways. A group of fifth graders started a kindness club, organizing events like Mix It Up Day, where students sat with peers they didn't know during lunch. Another group initiated a pen pal program with students from a neighboring school, fostering connections and breaking down stereotypes. Even teachers were inspired. Mrs. Hampton, Elijah's art teacher, introduced a unit on cultural art traditions, encouraging students to share their own heritage through creative projects. And Mr. Carter, the history teacher, began incorporating lessons on social justice and civil rights into his curriculum, sparking meaningful discussions among his students. At home, Lisa and Mr. Thompson continued their work with the Belonging Project, which had expanded to include partnerships with local businesses and organizations. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Elijah spoke up. "Mom, Dad," he began hesitantly, "do you think the Belonging Project could help other schools, like in different cities?" Lisa and Mr. Thompson exchanged glances. "That's a big idea, Elijah," Mr. Thompson said. "What made you think of that?" "Well," Elijah said, twirling his pencil, "I was talking to Marcus, and he said his cousin lives in a place where kids get treated really unfairly. He said they don't have anything like the Belonging Project there. So, I thought maybe we could help." Lisa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Elijah. It's a big goal, but big goals are how we make big changes. We'd need a lot of help," Mr. Thompson added thoughtfully. "But if enough people believe in the idea, there's no limit to what we can do." In the months that followed, the Belonging Project expanded beyond the Thompsons' community. Lisa and Mr. Thompson began collaborating with educators and activists in other cities, hosting workshops and sharing their framework for building inclusive school environments. With the help of donations and grants, they launched a website and created toolkits for parents, teachers, and students, making their resources accessible to anyone who needed them. Elijah played an active role in the expansion. At just 10 years old, he became the youngest speaker at a regional education conference, where he shared his story with a room full of teachers and administrators. Standing on the stage, microphone in hand, he spoke with a confidence that amazed even his parents. "When I first walked into Mrs. Blackwell's office, I felt small," Elijah told the crowd. "But now I know that I'm not small at all. I'm strong, and I have a voice. And so do all of you. Together, we can make sure every kid feels like they belong." The audience gave him a standing ovation, and in that moment, Elijah realized the true power of his journey. Back at St. Thomas Elementary, change continued to ripple through the school. Principal Edwards, inspired by the progress she had seen, introduced a district-wide initiative called Every Voice Matters. Under this program, schools held monthly assemblies where students could share their experiences and ideas for improving their communities. One day, during one of these assemblies, a first grader named Amara stood up to speak. "When I started school, I was scared because I'm different," she said, her small voice trembling. "But then I saw the mural, and it made me happy. It made me think maybe I belong here too." Her words brought tears to the eyes of many in the audience, including Elijah, who was sitting in the front row. After the assembly, Amara approached Elijah, clutching a crayon drawing of the mural he had designed. "Did you make this?" she asked, holding up the picture. "Yeah," Elijah said, smiling. "I wanted everyone to feel like they belong." Amara beamed. It worked. Years later, the Belonging Project became a nationally recognized organization. Schools across the country implemented its programs, and its founders were invited to speak at conferences, write books, and consult with policymakers. But no matter how much the project grew, its roots remained firmly planted in the small kitchen where the Thompsons had first envisioned it. For Elijah, the lessons he learned during that pivotal time shaped the person he became. As he grew older, he continued to advocate for inclusion and equity, eventually pursuing a career in social work. He often visited schools to speak with students, sharing his story and encouraging them to stand up for what they believed in. On the 10th anniversary of the mural's unveiling, St. Thomas Elementary held a special ceremony to celebrate its impact. By then, Elijah was a young man, but as he stood before the mural, he felt the same sense of pride and hope he had felt as a boy. The principal handed him a plaque that read, "In honor of Elijah Thompson, whose courage sparked a movement." As Elijah looked out at the crowd of students, parents, and teachers, he knew that the work of belonging was never truly finished, but he also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was a step worth taking. And in that moment, surrounded by the people whose lives had been touched by his journey, Elijah understood the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't about monuments or accolades. It was about the countless hearts that had been changed along the way. The future we build together. The mural at St. Thomas Elementary became more than just a piece of art. It became a symbol of transformation, resilience, and hope. Over the years, it inspired countless students, teachers, and families to reflect on the power of belonging. For Elijah, though, the mural was only the beginning of a lifelong mission. Now in his 20s, Elijah had grown into a thoughtful and passionate advocate for equity and inclusion. His experiences as a child had shaped not only his career, but also his worldview. He graduated from university with a degree in social justice education and co-founded Belonging Beyond Walls, a nonprofit organization dedicated to dismantling barriers in education, workplaces, and communities. The organization's mission was clear: to build a world where every person felt valued, included, and empowered to thrive. Through Belonging Beyond Walls, Elijah worked with schools, businesses, and local governments to create programs that fostered inclusivity. He developed mentorship programs for underserved youth, launched scholarships for marginalized students, and partnered with artists to create murals in schools and neighborhoods that celebrated diversity. Everywhere Elijah went, he carried with him the lessons he had learned as a child, that every small act of courage and kindness could spark lasting change. One day, Elijah received an invitation that both surprised and excited him. The National Education Equity Conference, one of the most prominent gatherings of educators and advocates, wanted him to deliver the keynote address. The theme of the conference was Building Bridges for Tomorrow, and Elijah's story was seen as the perfect embodiment of that vision. As he prepared for the speech, Elijah reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about his parents' unwavering support, the courage it took to confront Mrs. Blackwell, and the community that had rallied around the Belonging Project. He thought about Amara, the first grader who had found solace in his mural, and the countless other children who had found strength in its message. On the day of the conference, Elijah stood backstage, a mixture of nerves and excitement bubbling within him. When his name was announced, the room erupted into applause. He walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him, and looked out at the sea of faces. Educators, policymakers, parents, and students were all there, waiting to hear his words. Elijah began his speech by recounting the story of that fateful day in the nurse's office at St. Thomas Elementary. As he spoke, he could see the audience hanging on to every word, their expressions shifting from anger to empathy to hope. "What I learned that day," Elijah said, his voice steady and clear, "is that even when we feel small and powerless, our voices matter. Standing up for ourselves and for others isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Because when we act with courage, we create ripples that can grow into waves of change." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Belonging isn't just about being included. It's about being valued for who you are. It's about knowing that your identity, your culture, and your experiences enrich the community around you. And it's about creating spaces where everyone feels safe enough to be their authentic selves. Elijah shared stories of the impact the Belonging Project had made over the years, the students who had become leaders in their schools, the teachers who had transformed their classrooms, and the communities that had come together to celebrate their diversity. He ended his speech with a challenge to the audience. "I stand here today because people believed in the power of belonging. They didn't just talk about change. They created it. And now it's up to us to keep building. Let's be the bridge for the next generation. Let's create a future where every child, no matter where they come from, knows they are seen, heard, and valued. Together, we can build a world where belonging is not the exception, but the rule." The room erupted into a standing ovation, and Elijah felt a swell of gratitude. He knew this was more than just a moment. It was a movement. After the conference, Elijah was approached by educators and activists from all over the country. They shared their own stories of struggle and triumph, seeking advice and offering support. One teacher, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, told Elijah, "Your story reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. Thank you for reigniting that passion." Another attendee, a teenage girl who had spoken at a breakout session, handed Elijah a notebook. "I wrote some poems about belonging," she said shyly. "I wanted you to have them." Elijah accepted the notebook with a warm smile, promising to read every word. As Belonging Beyond Walls continued to grow, Elijah faced new challenges. Expanding the organization required balancing his vision with the practical realities of running a nonprofit. There were moments of doubt, times when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, but Elijah drew strength from the people around him. His parents remained his biggest cheerleaders, offering wisdom and encouragement whenever he needed it. And his team, a dedicated group of educators, artists, and activists, shared his passion and drive. One of the organization's most ambitious projects was the Pathways to Belonging initiative, a program that brought together schools from different socioeconomic backgrounds for collaborative learning experiences. Students worked on joint projects, explored each other's cultures, and built friendships that transcended stereotypes and prejudices. Elijah visited one of the schools participating in the program and watched as a group of students presented a project on creating inclusive communities. One student, a boy who reminded Elijah of himself at that age, said, "We learned that when we listen to each other, we can do amazing things together." Hearing those words, Elijah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the future he had dreamed of, a future where young people were leading the way, breaking down barriers, and building bridges. Years later, Elijah returned to St. Thomas Elementary for a special celebration. The school had decided to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the mural with a new addition, a companion mural designed by current students. The event was attended by alumni, teachers, parents, and community members, all gathered to honor the legacy of belonging that Elijah had helped create. As Elijah stood before the original mural, now slightly faded but still vibrant, he felt a wave of emotions. He thought about the scared, confused boy he had been all those years ago and the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the countless people who had joined him along the way, each contributing their own piece to the puzzle of change. Principal Edwards, now retired but still active in the community, approached Elijah with a smile. "You've done something extraordinary," she said. "This school, this community, it's a better place because of you." Elijah shook his head, humbled. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us. And it still is." As the celebration continued, Elijah watched as the next generation of students painted the new mural, their laughter and chatter filling the air. He knew that the work of belonging would never be finished, but he also knew that the seeds he and others had planted were growing into something beautiful. And in that moment, surrounded by hope and possibility, Elijah felt at peace. The future was in good hands. Global ripples of change. Elijah's journey had transformed from a personal mission into a global movement. 25 years after the incident that sparked the Belonging Project, Elijah found himself at the forefront of a worldwide conversation about inclusion and equity. What had started as a local initiative now had chapters in over 30 countries, each adapting the principles of belonging to their unique cultural contexts. The call to the world stage. One morning, Elijah sat in his modest but bustling office at Belonging Beyond Walls headquarters in Chicago. The walls were adorned with photos from past events, children standing proudly in front of new murals, teachers holding workshops, and communities gathering for festivals that celebrated diversity. As he sifted through emails, his assistant knocked on the door. "Elijah, you're going to want to see this," she said, holding up an envelope with a distinctive gold seal. He opened it carefully, revealing an official invitation from the United Nations. They wanted him to speak at the upcoming Global Summit on Human Rights and Social Equity in Geneva, Switzerland. The theme: creating a world where everyone belongs. Elijah stared at the letter, a mix of disbelief and gratitude washing over him. He had always dreamed of spreading the message of belonging on a global scale, but this invitation confirmed that the world was ready to listen. Preparing for the summit. The weeks leading up to the summit were a whirlwind of preparation. Elijah worked with his team to gather data, stories, and visuals that showcased the impact of their work. He wanted his speech to highlight not only the challenges, but also the extraordinary resilience and creativity of the communities they had worked with. One story that stood out came from a small village in Kenya, where the local chapter of Belonging Beyond Walls had partnered with schools to create an intergenerational garden. Elders shared traditional farming techniques with students, while the students taught elders basic literacy and digital skills. The garden became a symbol of unity, bridging generations and fostering mutual respect. Another came from a refugee camp in Lebanon, where volunteers used art therapy to help children process their trauma and connect with one another. One child had painted a mural depicting hands of all colors lifting the earth, with the words, "Together we carry the world." Elijah decided to incorporate these stories into his speech. They were proof that belonging wasn't just a concept, it was a force for healing and transformation. The day of the summit. The summit was held in a grand hall with delegates from nearly every country in attendance. As Elijah walked to the stage, he felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just representing himself or his organization. He was carrying the voices of millions of people who believed in the power of belonging. The audience fell silent as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice steady, "the world we share is more connected than ever before, yet so many people still feel invisible, excluded, and undervalued. But I stand here today to tell you that belonging is not just a dream, it's a reality we can create together." He shared the story of St. Thomas Elementary and how it had sparked a movement. He spoke about the challenges of overcoming bias, the importance of listening to marginalized voices, and the extraordinary capacity of human beings to grow and change. But belonging, he said, pausing for emphasis, is not a gift we give. It's a right we honor. It's the foundation of justice, peace, and prosperity. When we build spaces where everyone feels they belong, we don't just uplift individuals, we transform entire communities. The audience responded with thunderous applause. A global network. After the summit, Belonging Beyond Walls experienced a surge of interest and support. Governments, NGOs, and corporations reached out, eager to collaborate. Elijah's organization launched initiatives in new regions, including a project in India that worked with schools to integrate children from different castes, and a partnership in Brazil to combat racial inequality in urban education. One of the most ambitious projects was a global youth exchange program. Through this initiative, students from different countries connected virtually and in person to share their cultures, learn about social issues, and collaborate on solutions. Elijah was particularly moved by a friendship that developed between a Syrian refugee in Germany and a high school student in Japan. Together, they created a video series exploring the meaning of home, which went viral and inspired thousands. Challenges and resilience. Despite its successes, Belonging Beyond Walls faced its share of challenges. In some regions, resistance to inclusion was strong and progress was slow. Elijah and his team often encountered entrenched biases, systemic inequalities, and political barriers. One particularly difficult moment came when a new program in Eastern Europe faced backlash from a small but vocal group that opposed the inclusion of Roma children in mainstream schools. Elijah flew to the region to meet with local leaders and families, determined to listen and find common ground. During one meeting, a grandmother stood up and said, "My grandson wants to go to school, but he's afraid. He says the other children don't see him as human." Elijah's voice cracked as he responded, "No child should ever feel that way. Together, we'll change this." Through patience, dialogue, and persistence, the program eventually gained support, and the first Roma-inclusive school in the region was celebrated with a community festival. Coming full circle. Years later, Elijah returned to his hometown for a reunion at St. Thomas Elementary. The school had undergone many changes over the decades, but the mural he had designed as a child remained, now preserved under a protective glass frame. Beside it was a new addition, a plaque listing the names of students, teachers, and community members who had contributed to the school's culture of belonging over the years. As Elijah walked the halls, he noticed how the school's atmosphere had transformed. Students of all backgrounds played and worked together with a sense of ease and mutual respect. During the reunion, Amara, now a teacher at the school, introduced Elijah to her class. "This is Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with pride. "He's the reason I became a teacher, and he's proof that one person can make a difference." Elijah smiled, addressing the students. "The truth is, you all have the power to make a difference. The world needs your ideas, your courage, and your kindness. Never doubt that you belong, and that you can help others belong too." A legacy beyond borders. As Elijah looked back on his life's work, he realized that belonging was more than just a destination. It was a journey. It required constant effort, reflection, and renewal. But the impact of that effort was profound. Through murals painted on school walls, policies rewritten to promote equity, and relationships built across cultures, Elijah saw the world becoming a little brighter, a little kinder, and a little more just. and he knew the journey would continue, carried forward by the countless people he had inspired along the way.